Okay, so welcome to our presentation on Ryanire and SAS. My name's Ollie, this is Will, Joe, Nicole and Saskia. Today, as I said, we're going to be talking about Ryanire and SAS, but then also the airline industry as a whole. So a quick background on the airline industry. It's opened up new opportunities across the globe by shortening travel time and changing our concept of distance. Currently in 2012, it was valued at $711 billion, which we feel really demonstrates its value and importance in the industry today. Okay, so a quick background on what we're just going to do and what we're going to talk about today. Saskia and I are going to start off discussing the regulatory changes made by the EU in the early 1990s and how that impacted Ryanire and SAS. Then Will and Nicole are going to move on to talk about other factors that influence Ryanire and SAS. And finally, we're going to finish off by talking, Joe's going to talk about how the future regulatory changes may impact these businesses. Okay, so SAS, it was founded on the 1st of August 1946. It grew quickly, and by the time when the regulatory changes were introduced, it was one of the major players in the Scandinavian airline industry. As you can see, it was split into 3 sections, as demonstrated by this pie chart. Okay, so before deregulation in the airline industry, there were very high barriers to entry. This meant that it was hard for new airlines to enter the market. Routes could also not be poached, and prices were fixed. Yeah, it was very hard. It was really hard for new firms to come in and really make an impact on the industry. Most of the airlines were state-owned, and this is the primary reason for this regulation. It meant that companies like Alitalia and Air France, who were owned by their nations, the governments were keen to protect competition of these carriers.
So it was realised that prices on most routes were considerably higher in Europe than they were for a similar distance in the US, and this was largely due to the deregulation of the US airline industry in 1978, and the dream was to replicate the success that the US had witnessed. In fact, when planning a conference in 1984, the Federation of European Consumers realised that it would be cheaper to fly all delegates out to Washington DC than to have to meet anywhere in Europe, which really highlights how different the prices were in Europe to the US. So they wanted to replicate this success. So in 1991, certain rules were relaxed, allowing new airlines to fly into and out of Heathrow. But the biggest change came in 1992, when all carriers were given the right to operate scheduled services between all EU states. Airlines were also given greater freedom to set their own prices, and there were significantly lower barriers to entry for all EU carriers. This was known as the Open Skies Policy of 1992. Transport Minister John McGregor of Britain said that it was a real opening up of European skies to competition. It will sweep away restrictions on low fares, and complicated fare setting rules will be swept away.
Okay, so the effects of the deregulation. There were 58 new airlines that entered. However, 51 of these airlines actually withdrew fairly quickly. There was also increased competitiveness, and this was mainly due to the ability of firms to set their own prices. This in turn led to more non-price competition, which was particularly evident through sort of customer services and an increase in quality of customer service. The main way that they achieved this was through increased punctuality and reliability to really establish customer loyalty and attain high levels of customer retention. Another way that this was allowed was by the introduction of frequent flyer programs. This basically allowed frequent travellers or regular travellers to accumulate points, which then gave them free travel or free flights.
So a prime example of an airline that used the deregulatory changes to their advantage is Ryanair. Established in 1985, Ryanair started out with just one 14-seat aircraft flying between Waterford and Gatwick, with the aim of breaking the duopoly on London to Ireland flights held by BA and Aer Lingus at the time. Ryanair expected to carry around 650,000 passengers in 1 year. However, today, 28 years later, Ryanair has a fleet of 303 aircraft flying to 180 airports around the world and around Europe, and carrying 79 million passengers in 2012. It's also been dubbed Europe's most profitable carrier. Evidently, Ryanaire's success in the past decade has been extraordinary, and this can largely be linked to the way in which they exploited the deregulatory changes of 1992. Ryanair capitalised on two regulatory changes in particular that Ollie will now have a look at, and that is price setting and freedom of travel.
So with price setting, Ryanair quickly moved to a no-frills policy. This meant that they were able to reduce their costs and as such increase their profitability. The main way that they did this was decreasing the costs of their aircraft. They didn't introduce reclining seats, there was no back pockets in front of the traveller, and there was also life jackets were stored overhead rather than underneath the seats. Whilst cutting costs, these allowed Ryanair to get more passengers on board each flight, which in turn obviously increased their profitability. They really marketed themselves as a point A to point B traveller, which emphasised the fact that you were only paying for something that you actually needed and wanted. There was also an appearance of low barriers to entry due to the changes made, and it allowed Ryanair to enter the market, as Saskia said, with just one aircraft. This before probably wouldn't have been possible due to the competitive nature of the industry, and this really, we feel, shows that the EU achieved their goal of increasing the competitiveness of the industry.
SAS, however, didn't have so much success as Ryanair. Although still the largest airline in Scandinavia in terms of revenue, passengers and flights, transporting over 24 million passengers and achieving revenues of around 33.9 billion, they have struggled to cope with the deregulation of the airline industry. This is because due to new entrants in the market, they were forced to reduce fares and their operating costs. But unlike Ryanair, who moved from a with frills to a no frills policy, SAS did not implement a radical change in strategy, and as such have seen a radical fall in their profits.
So in this slide we have listed all the management abilities for a normal industry to have, and in the next slide we picked 3 of these that we think airline industries should have. And as we can see, Ryanair did these really well, because back in the day they weren't sure that this no frills policy would actually work. But Ryanair, they acted under uncertainty, they were extremely flexible, and they were there at the right time, and that's what made Ryanair succeed, whereas SAS didn't.
Okay, next we're going to look at Ryanair's performance in terms of their cost-cutting techniques. Here's a short video explaining what main area people look for when booking flights, as well as a short clip from Michael O'Leary, the CEO of Ryanair.
When you're choosing an airline, what factors do you look for? Price.
Yeah, price.
It would be the sign up for that presentation. Or definitely fast.
Okay, so cheap. Thank you, Dave.
It depends. Sometimes it's about price, so the cost is actually affordable. The second one is whether the company is actually reliable.
Low price.
That is Ryanair's Chief Executive Michael O'Leary. Breaking news coming in. Ryanair, they've made lots more money in the past year. 435 million up to 437 for year-on-year profits. Michael O'Leary, congratulations. Is that a planned profit or a pleasant surprise?
Good morning, sir. It's a very pleasant surprise. We've been growing rapidly across Europe as other airlines are going bust. And people keep switching to Ryanair for the low fares, the new aircraft and the on-time flights.
Yeah.
Okay, so as you can see from our statistics we've got from our survey of 30 individuals from around the university, price was of key importance. Obviously the limitations of our survey is that we only asked 30 people, and obviously ideally we'd ask more. Next we're going to talk about Ryanair's, they basically had 4 main actions that they implemented in order to cut costs and therefore offer a lower price to their customers. They used the lucrative actions in order to do this, which basically specialises in mainly focusing on increasing profits and decreasing costs. The first action they implemented was to use one type of up-to-date plane. This meant that they could buy in bulk, which therefore get a large discount. They also had lower maintenance costs as the planes were newer, and had the same supply, which obviously so maintenance was lower. As well as this, the planes are more efficient because they were newer planes, so fuel costs were also lower. The second point was a quick flight turnaround. This meant that they could increase their revenue by having more flights per day, therefore flying more people every day. As well as this, they charged on their luggage, as luggage took time to load the planes and weighed heavier, and so they had to use more fuel, so increasing their costs. The next point is to keep their overheads down. They chose to land at airports, and normally, when possible, away from the cities, as the city airports incurred high landing charges. Some airports away from the cities also paid airlines to land with them in order to gain business, so revenue could be generated in this way. They also had online check-ins, which meant that they saved money in high charges of checking desks at the airports and so on, and obviously labour charges. The fourth point was that they made their employees pay for their training and their uniforms, as compared with other airlines where they are often paid for by them, such as British Airways. The fourth and final action they implemented was to increase the number of shorter flights. As for every short flight they could earn more money, they could do more trips per day, therefore increasing revenue. As you can see, by implementing these four actions, their share price dramatically increased over 10 years and over doubled, and so because of being able to offer lower prices. Next, Nicole's going to talk about SAS's performance.
Okay, so unlike Ryanire, SAS hasn't been doing so well in the past 10 years. There are a number of factors besides the direct conditions that we found. The first one is that it is government owned. It's what we would call a nationalised industry. These were very popular back in the 1920s before globalization. And once globalization occurred, that increased competition and the drawbacks of government-owned companies were made obvious in that they really weren't efficient. This is when the big policy switch took place in the 1980s and 1990s. Since then, countries such as the UK, China, and the US set up a whole different industrial policies. They believed in fair competition between organizations and that the government should focus on regulating the competition as well as creating the microeconomic conditions so that organizations can compete around the world. However, countries such as France and the Scandinavian countries, where SAS is founded, were not so keen on this concept. And therefore SAS is still government owned, and that's one of the major drawbacks in their management. SAS is portrayed as being a more expensive, luxury, environmental friendly company, whereas Ryanire isn't. However, as we saw in the video and from our survey, nowadays people don't really care about that much about the other factors, and they focus more on price. Therefore, SAS was suffering in its financial side as they had to compete with low-cost airlines, which was the competition with cheaper fares, such as Ryanire. A third way, one way of making profits is by reducing labour costs and selling their assets, and that's exactly what SAS did. The first way they cut costs was by selling their stakes to other companies, such as BMI in 2008, and in 2012 they had to cut major costs, and this was pressured by their owners and their banks. And they did so by reducing the salaries from 12% to 20%, and they also cut retirement plans. And therefore the employees were extremely demotivated and they endured negative publicity. Another main factor is the economic crisis. People had fewer jobs with less income and therefore looked mainly at price and ignored other factors in an airline. As we see in this quote, tourism decreased tremendously in the last decade. And this is because people decided to go on holidays in their own country instead of going abroad because they couldn't afford it. In addition, another factor may be that all three home markets are fairly small. There are only 20 million people, and that's less than just New York alone. So from the start, SAS targeted a market was very limited. One final important factor was the type of airplanes in use in this fleet. According to this airline intelligence provider, the 737-600s were not cost efficient per seat because they were smaller, and Ryanire used very more cost efficient airplanes. As we can see here, in the past 10 years, the stock prices decreased by a lot, and that's not only because of the economic crisis of 2008, but because of the other factors I just mentioned.
So before I talk about the future prospects with the current regulations, I'd like to give you a little interesting history about Ryanire and SAS. A little bit over a year ago, in July 2012, Ryanire experienced 3 emergency landings in one night at the Valencia airport. Now, it is uncommon to even have 1 emergency landing, but Ryanire experienced 3 in one night. This garnered a lot of negative publicity and public unrest. However, based on the further investigations, it was proven that they did have legitimate reasons for experiencing the 3 Mayday calls, just because they were in the air for an extended 1 hour due to adverse weather. However, the matter of fact is that there were other aircrafts from other airlines in the air as well, and they did not experience the emergency landings. For SAS, in 2007, they had 27 Bombardier Q400s, which made 5% of their fleet of aircrafts. However, the Bombardier Q400s were experiencing a series of crash landings, so that made a lot of customers less confident about those aircrafts in their fleet. One thing admirable about SAS was that even before the investigations were closed and the verdicts were out, they decided to pull all 27 of the Bombardier Q400s out of their fleet. Now, this shows a lot about SAS because they valued the loyalty and the confidence of the customers more than the loss that they were to suffer if they pulled out 27 aircrafts out of their fleet, which were very costly. So basically, what I'd like to talk to you about is the safety regulations in the current Regulatory Act. With all the Deregulations Act that my colleagues have been talking about, safety regulations is not something that will be liberalized in the near future, we believe, and it's not something that should be dealt with lightly. Like what Ryanire CEO Michael O'Leary said, any airline can only survive on reputation of safety. So basically, SAS showed high standards of safety, which made customers more trusting and that they're more confident with SAS rather than Ryanire. Due to the nature of the business of the airline industry, it is cyclical, unstable, and has high price elasticity. It is like always on a constant change. So what airlines like Ryanire and SAS have to do, well, what we think is the most important aspects of what they have to do to stay in the game and ahead of the game is cost reduction, product differentiation, service differentiation, and alliances to try and control the prices. Without these aspects, they're likely to see no profits or lesser profits in the future. So what SAS did was to adopt cost reduction. They tried cutting 800 jobs in a final call to save the airlines, as they have not been seeing profits for the past 10 years. This article was taken from The Guardian, and yeah, they definitely cut 800 jobs. Also, for product differentiation, they spent $3.3 billion for 12 new jets. So basically, they are having new aircrafts, less maintenance costs, and cost reduction for this. So with these actions put into their plans, they did see a full year profit last year. So that shows that adopting those aspects did help them create profit. For Ryanire, based on their bad reputation for customer service, they recently hired a new customer service director, and they have adopted new customer service plans. Firstly, was reduction in costs for the bags that are not checked in before. Usually, prices for those were 60 euros, but now it's halved to 30 euros. And for reissuing boarding passes, it was actually 70 euros before, and now it's cut to just 15 euros. Caroline Green, the new director of the customer service department, said that these are just the first in the series of the customer service improvements that they will and are planning to do. Also, they have a new free phone app for customers to check and book plane flights, enhancements on websites to be more user-friendly, and also they are allowing second-hand carry-ons instead of just one carry-on that they allowed before. Thank you for listening. Do you guys have any more questions?